change resistors and how to love them. Because I don't know if you remember Star Trek: The Next Generation with the Borg, and the whole idea that the resistance was futile. Because so when it
Oh,
came to change,
well,
is
Nick, in the
resistance
spirit of
futile? Maybe you could call this podcast "Is Resistance Futile?"
well, I think it's well, speaking of fresh takes on change resistance, I think that definitely, Nick, is one of them for sure. And I think it's great. But, in the spirit of everything that we've been chatting about, the evolution of change, if you will, the increased complexity in our world, the systemic views that we're wanting to take around change, these internal, externalized factors. It kind of begs, I would think, maybe similar to the Borg, Nick, that it is change, right? It's more complex, it's hairier, it's messier, and as a result, I would expect, and we do expect, that there is more resistance. We have resistance coming through the door before we even start initiatives. We have resistance in organizations before we start initiatives. We have resistance during initiatives. So I personally love resistance as a discussion. That may say a lot about myself as a practitioner, but I think it says a lot about ways in which we as practitioners can take a fresh view on change resistance and embrace them for the important roles that they play in informing the quality and the success of our change initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely get that, and I completely agree with you. There's something about resistance. It's a bit like the grit in the oyster. Um, you don't necessarily like the discomfort that they're asking you, but the discomfort is one of challenge, and challenge must be good because it asks you to think, and that's the great thing about resistance. I guess that the for me one of the hardest things I found is that most or quite a lot of my clients actually want to eliminate resistance. They don't want to work with it. And so is the first resistance the whole issue for you about how do you see resistance as something which shouldn't be resisted?
Yeah, well, I mean, it forms, let's face it, it forms an entire, assessment layer in change practice, right? The whole idea of resistance management. There is this anticipation, of resistance because it is considered sort of the thing, the undoing, if you will, the potential undoing, the danger zone in change. Um, and I will allow, I think, if it's not embraced, perhaps in the way that we're talking about today, or considered in the manner in which we are, it may just be, it's a real set of emotions. We've been talking about human-centered change, and resistance has so many threads, right? If we understand it, attitudes, right, towards change, specifically assumptions that are made in the absence of information, especially in early days, where we're not quite sorted and situated around what this change is and why the heck we're doing it. There are various, speaking back to, change and complexity. Big change is wide in an organization, and we can't possibly expect that every function in an organization is going to respond and receive change in the same way and have similar feelings about it, especially when the impacts could be so different. So I think those are things that are important to consider, is that maybe what you're pointing at is this old view of resistance that needs to be debunked first so that we can refresh it, still properly assess and plan for it, but refresh that view and embrace it accordingly.
I was curious about how do you see resistance manifesting itself? Because there's obviously oh right, we're going to down tools and we're going to go out and strike, and there'll be placards and honk your horn if you agree with this sort of thing outside the building. But that's very obvious resistance. What about the other types of resistance that you might have spotted?
Well, and you're playing into, my tendency to create acronyms, create packages, create little stories about these kinds of themes. But I do think of a few main archetypes, if you will, of resistors when we talk about change resistance. And I referred to one already. One is the historian, right? The person that remembers everything, especially around change that may have gone wrong historically. But they also have incredible information around the organization. So it's not just about change experience, it's about organizational experience. So that historian, and I love them. I love historians because they've got all the goods. They have tremendous amounts of wisdom and information. They hold what I call institutional memory, and they bring that really rich experience, and it's often the informal things, right? Not the stuff that's always on paper, not the things that we get through, hard analysis, if you will. So that's one resistor that I'm particularly in love with.
Mm,
Another one is the pragmatist. So they're not against change. They're not against anything really, but they're focused on the results. How practically can we get from points A to point B, right? Points to Z, if we will, and have it work and have the outcomes be operable. And I'm in love with that with them as well, because there's this idea I think that's really important in change. And I do honestly think that we need to collectively move more forward towards this, is this idea of operational change. We're very focused, many of us, on the initiative, on the project, on the endeavor. The organization tends to track itself towards, that delivery, if you will. And the pragmatist looks at it and says, okay, but will it work?
yeah, that's so important. I absolutely love both of those resistors because they actually make your change easier. I guess I'd like to throw in a couple of ones as you were talking. I was thinking about two who perhaps aren't quite as legitimate and authentic. There's those people who hold the historic memory, but they tailor it to their own needs or their own means. I can remember working in insurance actually when the technology first got to the stage where you could print out documents for people to sign. This is going back when you needed to print out documents. There was a story going around that you couldn't take this printer into someone's home because it would spill ink all over the carpet, and it never ever spilled ink all over the carpet. It was actually a heat based technology which didn't have ink actually in the machine. But this idea that someone had gone into someone's home and spilt ink all over the white carpet and had to pay for a new carpet. It was very embarrassing, and so da, 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 da. That story did the rounds in this insurance company for months afterwards, and that sort of resistance is quite difficult to to manage because stories like that are very visual and very impactful. And the other resistor I found was, and I don't know if you've had experience of this, is someone who says, I'm absolutely delighted. I'd love to be involved in this change. I think it's really important that I'm involved before it moves forward too far. So get me in at the beginning. Great. When would you like to see me? And they gave me a date 3 months further ahead. So people can do all sorts of things to stop you from doing what you want, and they can give you all the right words and all the wrong actions, which I think is interesting. So how would you deal with people like that?
Well, I think it's the last example you mean, the person that
Yeah.
is on one level we'll say outwardly committed, inwardly evasive, avoidant. I think that and this kind of plays into sort of, how do we embrace these folks? One of the ways is through, really strong change networks and organizations, things that you and I talk about quite frequently. I think that we do have a tendency in change. I think it's how we're designed often as people to be naturally inclusive. I think a little bit more rigor is important when we're bringing people into network to include these resistor types, these resistor personalities, for a couple of reasons. One, they bring us the truth and the quality. But I think behind that, we have to solicit very intentionally around the roles. So that person that you mentioned who is outwardly facing positive or prone to change, but otherwise unavailable, is not going to help our change network very well. They're not going to participate in ways, but maybe they could participate differently, and be solicited. If they're generally prone or positive to change, we can put them to work as general ambassadors, as people that are going to extend agency, into some activities. But I look at the hard work of networks as being largely populated by resistors or potential resistors because because they're going to be the most diligent and focused on the change activities, which you kind of made a great point around, which serve them, right, and pockets and gaps in the organization, but ultimately through our guidance as change practitioners, serve the global outcome. So there's that piece as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of doing it. I love the idea of actually, if you get a resistor, give them some accountability for solving the problems that they're raising, then what a great way of actually getting them on board. One of the things I have noticed about this strategy too, of actually involving them in the change in a way that brings them into the tent rather than having them outside shouting in, um, is that once you've got them on board, there's nothing quite as good as a former person who said, actually, this is never going to work, to go to be heard to be saying, it might just work, Well, this is really important because there's something about converting one resistor to a promoter, which is can be really powerful.
Absolutely. It's those shifts that I think can be really powerful and serve. I know we often talk about the work as it's in front of us, but where I think the real magic is that as we convert those archetypes, if you will, those resistance personalities forward, they inform future change. We're
Mm.
embedding other behaviors, right, around change perspective and management. So it's not that we're eradicating, to your earlier point, resistance at all. We're actually making a pointed statement that resistance is needed and welcome for shared change success. We need all the opinions. I think is really important to touch upon is the idea of quality. I think that a lot of resistors, if you will, are also focused on ensuring that the work is done well. And as a practitioner, I take that very personally in a positive way, in the sense that it also holds me accountable to the kind and quality and experience in the change that they are seeking, that they deserve, to be quite honest, that they may not have received in the same way before, but that we all know if we do it that way, if we can convert that way, if we can adjust enough, we're sold.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that works really well. And as you're talking, one of the things that occurred to me is a lot of this comes down to the conversations we have, which are actually designed to try and challenge some of the existing cultures and paradigms. And this then leads us into a space which is more about organizational culture and what's okay and what's not okay. And when we start working in that way, our role becomes one, I guess, of being more of a supporter, more of a coach and a mentor for the existing leadership team in how they respond to resistance, because our response can mirror and start to role model the responses that they want to give, and that can be really powerful.
Absolutely. It is a absolutely completely aligned with that, Nick. There is a very strong mandate in our change practice to inform change culture. We're not necessarily pretending or aspiring or even outwardly stating that we're there to shift organizational culture. But by modeling and demonstrating a change culture that includes all the things that we've been talking about and ideally has the results that we're seeking, we know that we are influencing and shaping back to those ripple effects that we're seeking in organizations. I think that again is one of the highlights of the work is not again, the work that we're doing necessarily in the moment, but the impacts we have on future change perspectives.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here because this is all really good stuff. But what sort of things might you expect to see happen in your organization if you take these approaches to dealing with resistance?
Well, I think that you'll see it in the metrics that we've established in the change. That's one level. So I think with any good change initiative or activity, we're already mapping towards benefits and successes that are shared. So back to your point about early solicitation, early engagement, co-ownership, a co-definition of what success looks like. So not just the leadership model, right, of success, what the organizational measures are, or even, the project delivery measures, which we all know well, but it's really looking at if we experience these changes, what does it look like? And specific to these individuals, it's going to probably be where they live in the organization, how they're performing, the roles that they play, the responsibilities that they have today relative to those that may change for tomorrow. I think it's also in things that we don't actively measure and change. We're going to see it in the communications. We're going to see it in the level of engagement as it extends through the organization. We're going to see it in our feedback systems, kind and quality. I think that in the networked approach that we have to being inclusive of resistors or resistance in general is the opportunity for us to learn, and it's not just about the capabilities that we're driving directly on the change either. It's also about the change capabilities that we're generating throughout the initiative and as they land in the organization. And I wish we measured those more often or reported on those because they matter. It's going to matter for every organization as they do this over and over and over again.
Absolutely. Wouldn't it be great, actually, if one of our measures of readiness is the extent to which we'd actually got engagement of resistors rather than the removal of resistance? Because the engagement of
Love that.
resistors would really give you the vehicle through which you could then make sure that post change you've got the energy and the challenge within the business to make sure that it absolutely worked in practice. Could be a
I
real.
love that. It would, and in a way, ultimately, um, it would be my joy that we didn't even really have that language at all,
Mm.
that it's so invested and imbued and integrated into the work that we do. It's just an assumption. It's my belief that all of us, myself included, I'm educated all of the time through this work, through the perspectives of others, especially through what we would define as resistors. They're just alternate perspectives. They're just keeping us honest. They're challenging practice as they should. At the end of the day, and where I feel really, really well challenged and educated through these activities is that it confronts your view of your practice relative to the view that you need to have on behalf of the organization. You're
Mm.
constantly challenged to park yourself relative to the people and the purpose of the change that you're working on. So it would be my joy to your point. I think it's an amazing metric to the point where there's no metric required at all. It just is. And it's part of our fabric. Yeah.
It would be lovely if, to your point about we don't even talk about resistance and we just talk about it as change improvement, because that's a much
Yeah.
better way of actually describing it, much more positive. We talk about business improvement as being a really useful thing. We're not saying, oh, we're doing everything badly, but change improvement, that's where resistance actually has the greatest ability to leverage, a change in the way that we do things. And, listening to these people and starting to help provide them with a platform through which they can actually be actively involved is better not just for the change, but for us and for then going forward, because you're creating that culture where speaking your mind about getting things better is seen to be a good thing and not a bad thing. And living in a world like that and working in an organization like that has to be a lot more fun.
Absolutely. It's all about reframing the role and applying it to all the things that you've just mentioned. So engagement, not evasion. The listening you've called out, which is so important, because they are telling us a little bit more about the why. It's not just a single story. And then that co-creation that you've referenced, throughout, involving them in the design, helping us to shape the path forward. And looking at skepticism, as you say, as a healthy quality for humans to have, right? We should be looking critically at those experiences and those activities that necessarily have impact on things that we value and that we think are important. I think that would be my final comment in my love for resistors and resistance, is that it comes from a place of connection, of passion, of care, of investment. Otherwise, they wouldn't. And that's the worst possible thing that could happen.